Thank you very much. Maybe I should put that here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Well, yeah, this is, as a matter of fact, lecture number 7 in the series of 10 lectures on language, culture and mind, evolution, development, and cultural aspects of cognitive linguistics that I'm giving at several Beijing universities. And the first thing I'd like to say is to thank my colleagues and hosts here at Beijing Normal University for kindly inviting me to give this talk. The title of which is something of a mouthful, I do agree, but I hope it will become clear the point of what I'm talking about as I go through. My talk today very much picks up on, let's say, the thematics of the last 2 talks, which have been about the semantics of space, at least in part. And here we move, as it were, from mappings from space to time. Before I start, I should acknowledge the support of the European Union in financing the research that I'm going to talk about. And I should make it clear that I'm talking on behalf of our research group, which includes Vani Sampaio from the Federal University of Rondônia, Brazil, Vera da Silva and Vera da Silva Sinha and Jörg Zinken, my colleagues from the University of Portsmouth. I'm going to pose a riddle to you, and I would like to give you a little clue, okay? Very often, a riddle is sort of the inverse of a metaphor. It takes, as it were, the target domain of a metaphor and expects you to give an answer by deriving that from the metaphoric mapping. This is a riddle which I came across in reading about one of the ancient Central American civilizations of pre-Columbian America, the Mayan civilization, and this is the Mayan riddle. The question is, what is a man on the road? Anybody give me an idea? The answer to this riddle is in the title of my talk. Another clue. Okay. So some of you will recognize that this is an example of the idea that that we find in many cultures, that life is a journey and so on. But as the man on the road is, as it were, our progression through life's journey. So time, by a process of metonymic condensation, becomes a man on the road. The Mayans, incidentally, were obsessed by time. Here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about the hypothesized universality of space-time analogy in language. I'm going to talk about cognitive artifacts and time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the people who were the participants of the study that I'm talking about, the Amondawa. I'll talk about time in Amondawa language and culture, how time is expressed, and the parts of the day and season in this culture. I'm going to ask a question, is there time as such in Amondawa? I will explain this notion of time as such. And then I will raise a number of issues and try to come to some tentative conclusions. Cognitive linguists have proposed that there is a universal tendency and perhaps a universal realization of that tendency across languages to map spatial motion to temporal motion, to, as it were, create a mapping between the conceptual domains of space and time, and have cited much linguistic evidence in support of this hypothesis. The recruitment of locative words and constructions to express temporal relationships in language is widespread. I will give some examples in a minute. These examples are from English, but they are typical of Indo-European languages. And one of the things that I would like to ask you to do as we go through this lecture, and in common with some of the other lectures, is to reflect a little bit about your language and culture and to see how that fits with your own experience of your language. In English, for example, we say the weekend is coming, come being a basic motion verb. We say the summer has gone by. We say he worked through the night, using a prepositional phrase. We say the party is on Friday, again using a prepositional phrase. We say he's coming up to retirement, again a motion construction. Or we say, I am going to get up early tomorrow, using the gonna construction, which we find actually in very many languages. Here are some of the conceptual schemas which have been proposed by cognitive linguists to organize space-time analogies, such as the ones that I've shown you. We have the schema of an experiencer moving through a time landscape. So, for example, he is coming up to retirement. Involves the movement of the experiencer through the time landscape towards a goal or landmark. We also have events moving past the experiencer in a time landscape, such as the summer has gone by, or Christmas is coming up. And those two schemas are respectively called moving ego and moving time. In both moving ego and moving time, in the English language and in the vast majority of languages that have been studied, on the metaphoric time line, or within the metaphoric time landscape, the past is conceptualized as being behind the experiencer. However, there are languages in which there is a converse schema, in which the past is conceptualized as being in front of the experiencer and the future behind them. One such language is the Andean language of South America, Aymara, which has been studied by Rafael Nunez and Yves Switzer. For the Aymara, something that is interesting here is that for the Aymara, the reason why when participants are asked about this, that they say that the past is in front of them, is that they believe that the past is known, but the future is unknown. And you can see the past, but you can't see the future. And when Aymara people talk about when we talk about events in the future, if we use that front-back plane to make gestures, we tend to talk about events in the future being in front of us. Although actually more commonly we use a left-right axis in English speakers anyway. Whereas the Aymara, if they talk about the future, they gesture behind them. So it's a conceptual schema which is expressed in gestural communication as well as in language. And I've heard it said, but I still haven't managed to track down a good source for this, that the ancient Greeks also had the same schema as the Aymara, which would make sense given the Greek preoccupation with the notion of fate, in which, of course, all of us move towards an irrevocable and yet unknown fate. Okay. There is also another schema, which I call positional time, which is the notion of time as a kind of spatialized sequence of events, like beads on a string. And that is the notion of time which underlies before-after constructions, in which, for example, we can reverse the order of occurrence of events in the order of mention of events. So I can say things like, in the future I will be able to say things like, I was in China before Christmas, but I could also say before Christmas I was in China, yeah? And this notion of positional time also underlies grammaticalized time in tense systems in those languages which have tense systems, which of course is not all languages. Now the question is all of this universal? Well, some people claim it is, and they claim it is because of various reasons, including a kind of natural analogy between space and time, and it has also been claimed that some aspects of neurological structure motivate this universal. Well, it is true that the recruitment of spatial, lexical, and grammatical resources for conceptualizing time is very widespread. So much has been established. However, research into space-time analogies in language has only investigated a limited sample of languages and cultures. And there's a problem here because, as we shall see, because in such research, time is presupposed to be a distinct cognitive and hence also linguistic domain in all languages and cultures. The idea is that all languages and cultures have this domain called time. And I call this notion of time as a kind of abstraction, the notion of time as such. Of course, it is a concept which can be lexicalized in words like time, okay, but I mean more than that. I mean the idea that there is a conceptual domain called time within which events occur. And the other question that I think has never been properly posed is whether space-time analogies are a fact of language, where they do commonly occur, or of human cognition. Is it primarily a cognitive phenomenon, which is due to, for example, things happening in the human brain? Or is it a cultural phenomenon? Or is it somehow all of these, perhaps? And if so, in which ways might they interact? Now, at this point, I want to introduce you to the notion of the cognitive artifact. And those of you who have been to my earlier lectures know that that I have placed a great deal of emphasis on the work of the Russian psychologist Vygotsky in attempting to integrate cognitive linguistic with socio-cultural approaches to language and thought. What is a cognitive artifact? A cognitive artifact can be defined, or cognitive artifacts can be defined as those artifacts which support conceptual and symbolic processes in specific meaning domains. Now, of course, all artifacts are cognitive in some way because they're product of human cognition. This cup here is a relatively simple artifact which instantiates in some way the concept of containment, as we were talking about on Sunday. And it's intentionally produced. It's a product of human cognition. But when I use the term cognitive artifact, I'm talking about something very specific, a subclass of artifact which enables us to carry out reasoning processes symbolically supported reasoning processes in specific meaning domains. And here are some examples. Notational systems, such as writing systems or number systems. Dials, such as the dials that you'll find in a car, or instrumentation dials on machines for reading out, I don't know, tire pressures or velocity or anything like that. Calendars are cognitive artifacts, and I will be paying particular attention to calendars, or compasses, for example, are cognitive artifacts. A Chinese invention, I believe, actually. The point about such cognitive artifacts is that they enable people to do things in a way which they would not be able to do without such artifacts. They actually are transformative of human cognitive power. Now, another thing is that the cultural and cognitive schemas, and I have talked about cognitive and cultural schemas in earlier lectures, the cultural and cognitive schemas organizing, for example, time and number, can really be considered as dependent on and not just expressed by cognitive artifacts. So what I'm trying to say is that complex number systems, extended number systems, depend on having number notation. It is not that the number notation just expresses a concept of number which exists independently of that notation. Furthermore, if you think of time as expressed in a calendar, for example, let's take a cyclic notion such as the days of the week. So when we give names to the days of the week, as in English, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we embed these into a calendric system, what exactly are we doing? Are we taking concepts which already existed, independent of that notation, and independent of their organization, into a calendric system? No, we're not. We could not even think days of the week without naming them and without having some kind of artifact for representing that schema. Cognitive artifacts can be extremely complex, and in the case of the cognitive artifacts which support human cognition in the temporal domain, they often are. They also have a history. They did not come into being all at once. They are part of human cognitive history, if you like. And so the question I want to ask is whether the notion of time as such, okay, the idea of time, what I call here reified time, the notion of time as somehow independent of the events that, or the flow of events that actually really constitutes phenomenal time, phenomenological time for humans, the idea of a time domain independent of all of that, maybe that also has a history. And here, I want to come back to the notion that I have introduced in earlier lectures of what I call extended embodiment. Now, many of you know that cognitive linguistics is a approach in linguistics which emphasizes the importance of embodiment, and in particular the importance of the human body as a source domain for thinking about abstract conceptual domains. And of course I followed that insight on Sunday in talking about body part locative languages. But in my view, embodiment does not stop with the corporeal human body. It doesn't stop at the skin. The embodiment of human cognition goes beyond the human body to incorporate artifacts, and in particular cognitive artifacts. And here is a quotation from the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He says, "The body is our general medium for having a world." But then he goes on to say, "Sometimes the meaning aimed at cannot be achieved by the body's natural means. It must then build itself an instrument, and it projects thereby around itself a cultural world." And that is exactly the point that I'm trying to make with this notion of cognitive artifacts. They are part of extended embodiment, the extended embodiment by which we project ourselves or project around ourselves a cultural and a cognitive shared world. Here is an example of a cognitive artifact in the domain which we are talking about today, which is time. This is a medieval clock, which is still to be seen in the cathedral in the Swedish city of Lund. These medieval clocks can be found in many ancient cities of Western and Northern Europe, or Central and Northern Europe as well. And let me bring to your attention the complexity of this artifact. Up here, you have a clock face. As a matter of fact, it's a 24-hour clock face. Here, you have little automata, and once a day, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, these little guys come out and they circulate around here while a bell rings and a tune plays. Probably at some point in the past they did that every hour on the hour. This face here is a face which displays years, and around the outer rim of it you'll see the signs of the zodiac. Not the Chinese zodiac, but the European zodiac, or wherever they came from, these ones. So this tells us something about the complexity of cognitive artifacts. Something that is immediately striking is that, for example, both monthly, yearly, and hourly time interval systems are represented here as cyclical, okay? They're circular, okay? Now that cyclical schematization involving a kind of circle or wheel was not something that emerged simultaneously with the emergence of the mechanical clock. Early mechanical clocks, whether these were Chinese water clock or early European medieval clock, did not have a face. They didn't have this cyclical schema. Actually, they just used sound. And they were, the whole point of the early clock in medieval Europe was to regulate labor in the field. It was only later that the notion of the clock face was invented. So you see that these schemas and the cognitive artifacts that organize them are historically emergent. Calendric systems, then, I'm going to suggest to you, can be considered as instruments or artifacts which divide the substance of this rather fictional substance, or rather fictional notion of time as such, into quantitative units. Calendric systems have a recursive structure in which different time interval units are embedded within each other. And calendar systems are cyclic, and very importantly, they depend upon numeric systems. If you don't have numbers for counting time intervals and their progression, you can't have a calendar. Okay, that's the sort of preamble. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the community with whom we did some research on the language and cultural conceptualization of space and time, the Amondawa. Amondawa are an indigenous group of around about 115 people, so a very small community living in the state of Rondônia in Greater Amazonia, in fact in Amazonian Brazil. The first official contact between this group and the outside world was in 1986. The language they speak is a Tupi-Kawahib language, which is a sub-branch of Tupi, of the Tupi language family, which is the largest language family of South America. And Tupi languages have actually been described in the ethnographic and linguistic literature for centuries, ever since the Portuguese went to Brazil. And this particular language has been described, and linguistic ethnography has been conducted in general for more than 10 years. All the speakers are bilingual in Amondawa and Portuguese, except the two oldest people. By bilingual, I don't necessarily mean that they are bilingual in the sense that they have equivalent competence in two languages. I just mean that they speak two languages, are able to communicate. There is schooling in the village, and it is based on state education laws for indigenous peoples, in which the language of instruction is Amondawa, and the school is located in the village. Just to give you an idea of indigenous people and their languages in Brazil, each of the dots on this map of Brazil represents an indigenous language. There are more than 200 of them, indigenous languages and communities. And the group that I'm talking about is one of these ones here, right up against the Bolivian border, as a matter of fact. I'll tell you a little bit about the social organization of this group. It's based on exogamous marriage and division into two clans, or what anthropologists call moitié, meaning half, like the community is based in two groups. The two groups are called Mutu and Arara, or Canidea. This kinship structure determines the onomastic or naming practices of the group. So so it's in fact the woman who marries out of her moitié into her husband's moitié, okay? And that's the rule. You have to marry one of the other subgroups. And these groups are named after birds. This is the mutu, a dark-colored ground-inhabiting bird. It's not a flightless bird, but it spends most of its time on the ground. And here is parakeet, arara. The original name, arara, is actually the common name in Portuguese, although originally arara too was an indigenous name, but amongst this group, the original name for this bird was Canidea. And it's a very brightly coloured bird which lives in the trees. So you have here a kind of opposition between the ground and the sky, between dark and coloured, and so on. That's the village. These houses are not traditional dwellings. They're dwellings which have been built since contact. There's a whole lot of stuff that I could tell about this, but I won't. But if you're interested, I can tell you. Each of these dwellings now houses a nuclear family, parents and children. Here are some photographs of the Amazon environment. Here is a woman with a child. And one of the things that you can see here is that she has tattoos on her face. And this is part of the traditional culture. Well, yeah, I'm not going to... I thought I had more photos than that, but anyway, never mind. One of the things that we have done was to examine the typology of spatial motion in this language, and you have seen this. Those of you who have been at earlier lectures have looked at the satellite versus verb frame mapping patterns, and I'm not going to go into this in detail because it's not the main point of this lecture. But there is an important point to be made, which is this. Supposing we want to look at mappings from space to time in a given language, we have to be sure that we have lexical and constructional resources in the spatial domain to be mapped onto the time domain, okay? So we've examined space and motion in Amandawa, and what we find is this. Tupi languages such as Amandawa employ a variety of form classes, including verbs, postpositions, and adverbs to express locative relations and motion in space. We actually have just published an article on this group, which appears just about right now. It's just coming off the presses in a festschrift for Dan Slobin, who's done a lot of work on this area. And so you can, everything marked in red here is a locative term, a motion verb or a locative postposition, or in this case, a deictic adverb. Okay, so you can see, I'm not going to go through this in detail, you can see that there are a lot of constructional and lexical resources. The language has quite complex locative constructions, including gerundivizations, which are quite typical of verb frame languages. And these are the form classes, okay? Path conflating motion verbs, a go verb, an exit verb, an enter verb, an ascend or climb verb, and a descend verb. Locative postpositions, which are obligatory, which are rather familiar in terms of their meanings. Many languages have these kinds of polysemous postpositions, and directional and deictic adverbs, which are verb-derived, including inside, coming towards speaker, going away from speaker. So our analysis of the space and motion system suggests the following. Amandawa regularly employs path-conflating motion verbs in a wide range of construction types and is basically verb-framed in terms of the typology that Len Talmy has offered of motion constructions in languages. But it's not well characterized as a typical verb-framed language, or as I should say that with a different stress. It's not well characterized as a typical verb-framed language, having some features of equipollent languages, such as serial and multiverb constructions, and a strong preference for the specification of landmark in the construction. They don't like to leave it out. Amon Dawa has a profile of highly distributed spatial semantics in terms of the theoretical approach that I was talking about on Sunday, with a high degree of specification of path in motion constructions. This Tupi language tells us much about the adequacy of existing cognitive typologies. In fact, it tells us that they perhaps are not quite sensitive enough to all dimensions of variation. But there's nothing truly exotic about the language. Of course, it's unfamiliar. It was unfamiliar to us as analysts, unfamiliar to you. But it's not particularly strange. If you know anything about languages in general, you quite quickly get the idea of how Amon Dawa work. It's not exotic. And there's certainly nothing impoverished about the conceptualization and expression in Amon Dawa of motion in space. Looks like any other language. What about time? The Amon Dawa grammar and lexicon of time. The first thing to be said is that there is no abstract word meaning time. There is no word in Amon Dawa meaning time. It's not the only language about which that has been observed. And in general, the languages about which that has been observed are usually languages of non-technological culture. Secondly, past and future are not expressed in verbal morphology. There is no verbal tense system. Well, that's not so unusual either. In fact, Chinese does not have a verbal tense system either. And there are many languages which do not have a verbal tense system. But it doesn't. There is, however, a complex nominal aspect system. And what does that mean? I mean, we're used to the idea that aspect is expressed on the verb, but what does a nominal aspect system mean? Well, it just means that things like futurity or already having happenedness are expressed on nouns. And you could say it would be a little bit like English expressions like my ex-wife, or my house to be, or something like that. Yeah. So aspect is marked on the noun, but very complexly. There are only 4 numerals, and I will say more about this, but we think this is very significant. Although some people find it difficult to believe this, and they often think that this is just one of those kinds of tall stories about languages which don't have complex number systems. In Amon Dawa, there are languages known which have only 2 numbers. Amon Dawa has 4. Okay? There are no cardinal chronologies in which are expressed things like ages of individuals, and there are no ordinal chronologies such as yearly or monthly calendars. They don't exist. What does exist, I will tell you about. So here's the Amon Dawa number system. 1 is this term pei. 2 is the term monkoi. 3 is expressed alternatively either by monkoi apei or apei monkoi, which is the combinatorial of 1 and 2. And 4, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. But it goes something like 2 and 2 ones, yeah, or repeating 2, or yeah. So that's how it works. That's the number system. And you know, we've tried very hard to ensure that this is accurate, and we think it is. How is time expressed in this language? Well, there are various particles which can be one dependent on the other so that they reduplicate, for example, or else they come together. If we want to talk about an event occurring in the future, we have these particles here, nehe, poti, or poti nehe. And the different usages involve various intensifications of futurity. And the same is true of the past. And we think these morphemes also express other notions as well, but we haven't really figured it out or fully investigated them. But that's how you do future and past. In context, for example, the morpheme pair kiko could mean something like yesterday, but it doesn't mean, as it were, specifically yesterday. It could be yesterday or the day before yesterday. All right? Ko means now, but it could mean like today, this day. Koemame means something like when it is morning, which would be like tomorrow in the morning, etc., etc. So, how these terms are interpreted is very much dependent upon the context of situation. So here are some examples where in red are the particles expressing future or past. A proximal future or a distal future, or a past. Okay, that's how it works. So, I said that Amondawa doesn't have a calendric system. So what do they have? Do they have any way of talking about the passage of time on a kind of, as it were, large scale involving changes in the ecology brought about by, movement of the Earth around the sun and so on, and vegetation? Yeah, they have a system of naming of seasons. There are 2 seasons. The first season is the dry season, and it's called Kwaripe, and that comes from the noun Kwara, which means sun, and the postposition pe, which means in. Okay. So that's the dry season, and this season has 3 subdivisions, which more or less correspond to the beginning, the middle, and the end of the dry season. And they have another season, predictably enough, the rainy season, which is just called Amana, which is the word for rain. And this also has 3 subdivisions. corresponding to the beginning, the middle, and the end of the season. And these seasons mark changes in the weather, but they're also, of course, correlated with planting. Because, by the way, I should have said perhaps Amondawa are a small-scale agriculturalist society, and and have been for a long time. They do hunt and they do fish and they do gather in the forest, but they're not. You can't call them a hunter-gatherer society because they do cultivate crops as well, and that's a traditional practice. And in fact, in Tupi languages, reconstructions of Proto-Tupi suggest that terms for agricultural activities and implements go back around about 2,000 years. So we could draw something like a seasonal schema of the Amondawa schemas, which would look something like that, yeah. Amana, Quadripe, Amana, one succeeding the other. Is that schema, when we do something like that, is that the way they think about it? Or is that our invention as kind of analysts of their culture and community? We'll try and answer that question. We tried to answer it by doing an investigation as best we could of how the people themselves think about the seasonal schema. This is not very good, is it? No. It's a video grab. It's from a videotape of a task that we did. What you can see or not see here is you have one of our language consultants is seated here, and here you've got paper plates. And what we did was we gave the guy, yeah, maybe that would be good. Yeah? We gave the guy paper plates, and we asked him to place these plates in such a way that each plate represented one of the subdivisions of the seasons. Okay? So the subdivisions of the rainy season and the dry season. And he did that, and he produced this kind of structure. He just put one after the other, using his right hand, starting on the right and going over to the left and then going back again. And what he did was, he did it in such a way that it was easiest for him to reach, basically. That shape comes from the kind of distance between his shoulder and where he placed the paper plate. He didn't make any attempt to make a circular schema, and he didn't try to make it a straight line either, although it was linear. And he sort of doubled back on himself, so there was no necessarily left-right or right-left canonical order to this. It was really basically sequential. What about the day? We segment times of day by clock time, okay, by hours, minutes, and even seconds. For Amondawa, the day is divided into the morning, the afternoon, and the night. It's also further divided by customary activities such as time of waking, working, eating, resting, and sleeping, each of which has got a name and names that time of day. And night, of course, is marked by the disappearance of the sun and blackness, okay? This lexeme also includes the term for black. The interval systems of season and day have sub-intervals, but there is no superordinate year. There is no word in Amondawa for a unit comprising the dry season plus the wet season. There's no year. There's no name for the week or for the lunar month. They are aware of and are able to name and do name the phases of the moon in terms of what the moon looks like, but they don't use that to mark time intervals. There is one application, we think, of the 4-item numeral system to time intervals, which is enumerating moons, which are probably lunar phases, but we're not even sure about that. That's the only thing we've come across, and that's something that we need to investigate further. But we can really quite reliably say that there is no calendric system whereby, day sections are integrated into weeks and months or anything like that. There's no names for days, there's no names for weeks, there's no names for months. And there is no concept of year. Something particularly interesting about Amondawa culture and society is the way that they conceptualize the stages of human life in a system of naming of individuals, what anthropologists call an onomastic system. The Amondawa people changed their names several times during their lifetime. So any individual is born with one name and then gets another name and then gets another name and then gets another name. Okay? And these names are dependent upon facts about life stage and kinship. So from these names, we can infer the individual's age, rough age, life stage, let's say, gender, social position, and the moiety to which they belong. Here are some examples of these names. The life stages are here on the right. So you get a newborn, and depending on whether they're male or female, belonging either to the Arara or Mutung moiety, they get one of these names. Okay? But then when they get a bit older, they get another name. Or if another child is born, they sort of move up the stack, as it were, and they get the next name up. Because within the same nuclear family, you can't have two kids with the same name. Although there may be two kids with the same name within the moiety as a whole. And even if there isn't another child born, eventually they get the new name anyway. This is at least the traditional way in which they do things. There is a slight problem for this this particular social practice because the government keeps records of people for purposes like health provision, and the government doesn't like to have people's name changing. So they tend to give them one name, and that's the name they're stuck with for the rest of their life. And that's just a very small, telling example of the way in which contact between traditional cultures and the outside world rapidly gives rise to changes in these cultures and the disappearance of traditional practices. So you really have to go and study them before they, you know, before it all changes, basically. Questions about this onomastic system. The inventory in the previous slide is incomplete. But it is true that the inventory of proper names is both restricted and systematic. In other words, they don't just, you can't invent a new name, okay? The inventory of names is a kind of closed lexical class. So is it this quasi-closed class, does this indicate a sort of minimal grammaticalization of the naming system? And if so, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we think of time as being something which is constructed in like tense and aspect systems. For the Amondawa, the nearest thing they get to a grammaticalization of time outside these, the particles that they use for time reference, is actually their naming system. The structuring of time by events and activities. In our culture, time intervals are structured by cognitive artifacts such as calendars and watches. These artifacts impose a quasi-static cultural model on moving time, the schema of moving time. In other words, I know that, as it were, one day succeeds another. But if I have a calendar up on my wall, I can see all of these days displayed simultaneously, which is a kind of reification and a quasi-static cultural model of this notion that we have of moving time. In contrast, Amondawa time is structured by events in the natural environment, and in particular the seasons, and in what the anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu called the social habitus of activities, events, kinship, and life stage status. We can diagram Amondawa time, but there is always a risk of distorting it by imposing Western, inverted commas, cultural schemas of cyclicity and or linearity. Let's think a little bit about the notion of events. By definition, I suppose, events occur in time, not just in the sense of what I've called time as such, this kind of cultural construct of time as an abstraction, but also time as a phenomenological or experiential dimension. However, the conceptualization of an event as occurring in a temporal plane or in a temporal landscape requires a schematization of motion in a path defined by intervals. Using a verb of motion of the kind that is often used for, which is often mapped onto temporal relationships. But the gone here is much more a kind of signifier of absence of the salt. Or, you know, it was present, now it's absent. In the same way that little children in English, language acquiring children, will often use the expression all gone, yeah, to signify the absence of something which was there before. The summer is gone. Well, this looks a little bit more like a metaphoric construction using a spatial motion verb to talk about movement in time. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's more analogous with the salt is gone. Next term is coming. Here we're getting much closer, I think, to a genuine metaphoric construction of time as based on spatial motion. The point is that all of these expressions employ motion verbs, but I would suggest that they're not all temporal expressions in the true sense. Even the summer is gone is more about disappearance, or can be thought of as being more about disappearance than, as it were, time as such. How can we further determine how Amondawa culture and language structures time? Well, what we did was, we did another sort of informal field experiment in which we used small objects which we designated as being seasons, like the rainy season or the dry season, and we used small human figures as well. And we moved these around, and we tried to get people to talk about the appearance or disappearance of seasons. What did we get? We got expressions like this. The sun or the dry season goes now. The sun has crossed. The sun or dry season is coming. This is very interesting. It means there's nothing in Amondawa language or culture which prevents people from using verbs of motion to talk about events which are not actually really physical motion events, although there is a slight methodological problem here, because we were using these small installation models to do this. So there was physical motion, but the point is they used words which denote seasons and time intervals. So there's nothing, either in the lexicon and constructional inventory for space and spatial motion, nor in the grammar, which prevents using these, which prevents using motion verbs or other locatives together with time. The point is that when we look at what they do spontaneously, they don't, and they certainly have not elaborated this into any kind of system for talking about time in terms of spatial motion on a regular basis. Is there a positional time in Amondawa based on an intrinsic front-back frame of reference? Well, again, we find that we can elicit, using our installation models, expressions like the rainy season is moving in front of the dry season, okay? Or the night is coming up behind the sun. Remember that all of these would be done in connection with small models in which small objects represented times of day or seasons. Well, so we can elicit such expressions, but we never managed to record anything like this occurring in spontaneous speech. In other words, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that Amondawa people are just like anybody else. They're able to use spatial terms to talk about temporal intervals when they're provoked to do so by some kind of circumstance, including the circumstance that we actually kind of give them models and small objects and get them to talk about what's going on. But they don't do it as part of their everyday linguistic practices. And they don't have conceptual systems like calendars which are based on this, and they don't have grammaticalized terms for things like before and after. These things just don't exist. This question raises a number of, this research raises a number of questions. Firstly, I think that the claim that space-time analogies are universal presupposes the idea that time as such is a separate autonomous domain, and presupposes, if you like, that is a separate and autonomous domain that is universal in all cultures. The question is whether such a notion of time as such, as an abstract and reified domain, is possible at all without cognitive artifacts for measuring time, which itself will involve a numerical system, an extended numerical system. And therefore, is it the case in all cultural contexts? We think the answer is no. We think that in Amandawa, time is conceptualized in terms of events in the natural environment or in the social habitus of activities, events, and social structure, including kinship and life stage. And this could also be why time is apparently minimally grammaticalized in Amandawa, as well as not being regularly talked about in metaphoric terms. We are aware that there are a lot of methodological issues involved here. And the first methodological issue is that when we say we haven't found evidence of something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Fieldwork methods require long-term, intensive investigations. And although we've done about, I would say about 10 weeks of fieldwork extending over about 5 months of kind of being there, it's not enough. And there are certainly gaps in our data and perhaps systematicities we have not noticed and analyzed. The second methodological issue, of which we were not really aware when we started this, was the way in which concepts of time in Amandawa culture, just as in our culture, are bound up with norms and conventions, social norms and conventions. For example, here's a little extract from an interview with one of our informants. In this interview, the researcher, who was a woman, said to the informant, who's a man, suppose your wife you can't use a verb like suppose because it doesn't exist, but she says, your wife can't make lunch at the usual time tomorrow, so she moves it forward. And what the researcher was trying to get at was whether moving forward means bringing it towards the present or pushing it further into the future. And the language consultant says, my wife always makes lunch at Pururim Kwara, which means midday, okay, when the sun is at the highest. So the researcher then says, okay, it's me. I have to move the lunch forward. And the language consultant says, then you are a lazy woman. Because the point is, for these people, the time of day and the activity which is conventional at that time of day are so bound together that violating them is violating a social norm. And that's why, in some ways, it's actually quite difficult to try and get across these metaphoric mappings like moving forward and so forth. Does this mean that Amandawa are a people without time? Well, they do not have a calendric system. there is no evidence, or we haven't found evidence, of spontaneous moving ego and moving time constructions. We've tried to look for spontaneous stative positional time constructions like before, after, by doing other experiments which I haven't talked about. We haven't found it. There's no grammaticalized time, not really. In the grammar you just have these particles, you don't have anything like a tense system. And there's no lexicon of time as such. And although there is a complex space and motion system, and we have evidence of fictive motion in space, I'll come back to that, there is no convincing evidence of conventionalized linguistic space-time mapping. Now, what I mean by that is I've already said that there is a complex space and motion system. Talmy has this notion called fictive motion, which I talked a little bit about in earlier lectures. And fictive motion is something like, if we say, the mountain range goes from north to south, okay? And we use this motion verb, go, all right? Now, in fact, the mountain range is not going anywhere. What we are doing is we are linguistically conceptualizing the path of the mountain range in terms of the direction of motion of a fictive or virtual observer who might travel along that mountain range. Or we could say something like, the path goes to the river, okay? Now, we've tried to elicit constructions like that in Amondawa, and no problem, they do it. So it's not as if Amondawa people are reluctant to take spatial motion verbs and use them in what we might call metaphorical or analogical or quasi-metaphoric constructions. In this case, they do it. The point is they don't do it spontaneously with time. And the reason we think that they don't do that is cultural. It's not something to do with the language in itself. On the other hand, there's a complex nominal aspect system that Amondawa, like all human groups, are able to linguistically conceptualize inter-event relationships which are by definition temporal. They do talk about future and past, in other words. They lexicalize past and future in temporal deixis. And when I say they conceptualize inter-event relationships, they're able to tell narratives in which one thing follows on from another, and they can talk about, using discursive means, they can talk about the order of events. They have at least 3 event-based time interval systems. That is to say, they have the time and interval system of seasons, they have the time interval system of days, and they have the time interval system of life stage. They have cultural narratives of the collective past and mythic narratives. And so it would be just wrong to say that the Amondawa are a people without time, or that the Amondawa language is a language without time. What they lack, as it were, is the notion of time as such, as a domain which can receive metaphoric or analogical mapping from space. Conclusions. Claimed universals in temporal cognition and language, and in particular the universal metaphoric mapping of spatial motion to time, are motivated by compelling interdomain analogic correlation, Yeah, because motion occurs in time, and may be facilitated by neural structure. That could be true. However, the linguistic elaboration and entrenchment of space-time mapping is culturally driven. Time as such is not a cognitive universal, but a socio-cultural, historical construction based in social practice, semiotically mediated by symbolic and cultural cognitive artifacts and entrenched in lexicogrammar. Linguistic space-time mapping and the recruitment of spatial language for structuring time as such is consequent on the cultural construction of this cognitive and linguistic domain. We need to re-examine the notion of cultural evolution and its place in language and cognitive variation without postulating universal pathways of evolution in culture, and by situating cultural practices in social ecology and habitus. And I would, in fact now, I would take this one step further and say that we can now specify this as a particular hypothesis in relationship to space and time, which we call the mediated mapping hypothesis. The widespread linguistic mapping, lexical and constructional, between space and time, which is often claimed to be universal, is better understood as a quasi-universal, conditional, not absolute. Though not absolutely universal, linguistic space-time mapping is supported by universal properties of the human cognitive system, which, together with experiential correlations between spatial motion and temporal duration, motivate linguistic space-time mapping in linguistic conceptualization. However, the linguistic elaboration of this mapping is mediated by number concepts and number notation systems, the deployment of which transforms the conceptual representation of time from event-based to time-based time interval systems, eventually yielding the culturally constructed concept of time as such. And the conceptual transformation of time interval systems by numeric notations is in large part accomplished by the invention and use of artifactual symbolic cognitive artifacts such as calendric systems. And in the absence of these, we don't get the notion of time as such, and we don't get metaphoric space-time mapping. Okay, so that's our research so far on this topic, and we are hoping to get some more funding to continue it. And if we do, maybe I'll let you know more about it in the future. Thanks very much.